That's pretty intense, huh? Don't you love a good underdog story? I love that game. I'll tell you what, I'm a Buffalo Bills fan myself, and the Patriots are in our division. And I know we're playing the Bengals today, and I don't want any of you to feel bad or hold it against me when we knock you from the beast of the unbeaten later this afternoon. All right? I won't take it personally if you beat us, and I don't want you to take it personally when we will beat you later today. But when your team hasn't made the playoffs in like 16 years, you got to find something else to root for. And on that day, I was definitely rooting for the underdog. I love a good underdog story. And I think most of us do. You know, unless your team is the favorite, you're probably rooting for the underdog because you love to see somebody, you love to see a team overcome insurmountable odds and do something that you would never expect. And that's what the Giants did in that Super Bowl, up against the 18-0 Patriots. Earlier in the week, Tom Brady had laughed them off for thinking that they would only score 17 points, and the Patriots only scored 14 points. And I'm just going to rub that in just a little bit right there. You know, but Vince Papale had that kind of a story too. You know, he was a guy who never played college football. He was basically just bartending in Philadelphia, and he got a chance to go out to play for his favorite team at an age when many NFL players have already retired. And that's good news for guys like me because he was 30, I'm 31. I never played college ball either. That means I still have a chance. But Vince Papale was an underdog story. He overcame his doubt, and he made it to play in the league on one of his favorite teams for several years. Not just as a gimmick, not just to sell tickets. He actually made the team and contributed in significant ways. His nickname on the team was Rocky, from the famous movie Boxer, who was also an amazing underdog story. But what if their doubt had overcome them? What if Rocky had quit after Rocky won? Now, I know many of us think he should have quit after Rocky 4, all right? But if he'd quit after Rocky 1, he never would have beat Apollo Creed, he never would have faced off with Mr. T, and we would have missed out on some really cool stories. But that's just fiction. But Papale's story was real. What if his doubt overcame him and delayed his game, and he never tried out from the team and never even got in to an NFL game? What if that Giants locker room was overcome by their doubt, and they didn't believe that they could beat the undefeated Patriots? You know, we all face doubts, don't we? Sometimes for different reasons, but we all face doubt. But when our doubt overcomes us, it delays our game. It keeps us from accomplishing something that might be truly great. And this morning, as we continue our series in Playbook, we're going to see the doubt of a man named Gideon. A man that God was going to call to be the new quarterback of his team. But God is going to give him a tough assignment to lead the people of Israel, because as we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, Israel had fallen again into this vicious cycle of forgetting God's playbook. And if you remember that cycle, what happens is the people forget God's playbook. They forget what God had asked them to do and how He'd asked them to live and how He'd asked them to treat each other. And so God removes His blockers. He allows an opposing nation to come in and take over Israel. And when that happens, they get crushed. And they cry out for a new quarterback. They want a new leader. They want someone to save them from what's happening to them. And that's where we find ourselves in Judges chapter 6. And I want to read for you a little bit here from that passage. It says, "Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. So it was, whenever Israel had sown, that is, sown their crops, Midianites would come up, also Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. Then they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor donkey. So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord." So you see this cycle happening again. Israel was at the top of their game, but once again they forgot God's playbook. So He lets these opposing nations come in, led by the Midianites. And I think this is crazy what you see. It says here that whenever Israel had sown, the Midianites would come up and encamp against them and destroy the produce. Right, it didn't say that they moved in and they took over and that they took all the produce for themselves. Basically, they set up tents outside of Israel, came in and trashed everything and then left again. And then they would come back in another year and trash everything again. And essentially what they're doing is they're not even trying to live off of that land themselves. They're just trying to make sure that Israel knows who's in charge. Now, in football terminology, this would be a yellow flag. Personal foul, unnecessary roughness, automatic first down for Israel. But what's happening here is that Israel is caught in this cycle. And so you see it say that they cried out to the Lord. Now, God is going to answer them. When they cry out for a new quarterback, God is going to answer them. But the man that he is going to answer them with is a man named Gideon. And Gideon has some doubts of his own. And he's going to throw some challenge flags of doubt. And NFL coaches get a couple challenges a game where if they don't like what they see, they can throw that flag and say, I'm not sure that that's what's really going on here. And Gideon's going to throw some of those. And you may have challenge flags as well. Maybe like Gideon, you're up against some insurmountable odds. Maybe it's in business. Maybe it's in a relationship, something within your family. And it's one thing to fight and to win and to love the chase and love the competition. But it's another to go up against a well-funded army like Gideon was going to face. Maybe you're like Israel and you fear being at the top of your game like they were. And if you wonder if you're spending so much time chasing success, you wonder if you'll be able to sustain it or if you might have missed out on significance. One of the sources of our fear, as Chad has been talking about the last couple weeks, is whenever there is something in our life that begins to control us, that begins to motivate us out of fear, that becomes an idol that can blitz and blindside us just like Israel had been. Something that comes in between us and an understanding of God and drives us away from Him and into dark places in our lives. But God's grace doesn't do that. God's grace doesn't motivate us with words like never enough. You haven't made enough. You haven't prayed enough. You haven't given enough. You haven't performed enough. That is not the way that God speaks to us. But often that's how we motivate ourselves, by fear. And so we continue to drive down the field, but we're not really making any progress. Gideon threw challenge flags because he wasn't sure that he was ready to trust God as the play caller. Because he wasn't sure that he could trust himself. He had self-doubt. And he doubted the reactions of others, that if he tried to let God become the play caller, how would other people react to him? And when people throw these challenge flags, if you've ever seen coaches throw the flag, sometimes they're challenged a little bit. They kind of toss it out there. They're not really sure. Sometimes it's more like a Jim Schwartz. No, we are not going there. And I think you'll see that Gideon has a little bit of both of those going on this morning. I want you to think for yourself as we kind of move through this. What are your challenge flags and how hard are you throwing them? So look with me at Judges as we continue. This is in verse 11 of chapter 6. Because Gideon is about to get a visit from the play caller. Because if he's going to be the man, if he's going to be the leader that God thinks he can be, he's going to have to learn to trust the play caller. So it says, Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. Gideon said to him, Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, here comes his first challenge flag. Then why has all of this happened to us? And where are all his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Now you've got to get the setting here. Remember that the Midianites had been encamping like every year at the same time to come and destroy their crops. And so when we come into this moment, we see that what Gideon is doing is he's threshing wheat, but he's threshing it in a wine press. Now, do you know what you're supposed to do with a wine press? You make wine. This is not for wheat. In fact, to thresh wheat, you need a wide open space where you spread out all of the wheat to thresh it. You can use oxen, and then the wind can blow through to blow away the chaff. But Gideon is threshing in a wine press, which tells us two things. Number one, he's scared. It says right in this page that he's hiding it from the Midians, and so he puts it down in the winepress to thresh it. But the other thing that tells you is that there's not very much. That Gideon is in a tough spot. He only has a little bit of wheat to thresh, and he's going to do it in the winepress to try to hide it from the Midianites. So it's no wonder that when the angel of the Lord calls him a mighty man of valor, that Gideon's not so sure he's ready to believe what this messenger has to say. Now, something I want to point out to you here is that you'll see in this passage the phrase, the angel of the Lord, the angel of God. All of those are being used interchangeably to describe God himself. What's happening here is that the play caller himself has come to speak to Gideon. And he's taken on the form of a messenger to look like a man, to speak to Gideon in person. And so at this moment, Gideon doesn't really recognize him. Doesn't know if he's sure who this person is, who this messenger is, or if their message is true. And so look at how it continues in the next verses, because he's going to throw another challenge flag. Then he said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you." And there are a couple of verses missing there, but essentially what Gideon does is he goes back to prepare a meal for this messenger. And he brings it out and he lays it on a rock before him. And he figures as they'll eat, he'll just wait and see if he gets a sign from this messenger. I think it's worth noting here that Gideon is facing a lot of doubt. Already he's thrown two challenge flags into this conversation on who the messenger is and if that messenger is trustworthy. He doubts the play caller who is standing before him. But I want you to see the patience that God has with him. Because it's easy for us to look at a passage like this and to beat Gideon down and to say, you shouldn't have doubted. If it's God himself, then you better just listen and do what he says. But you know what? Doubt is normal. If there's anyone in this room who says that they've never faced doubt, I can tell you two things. They have faced doubt, and they're a liar. It's a knowing chuckle because we've all been there. And Gideon was there too. And the messenger doesn't ridicule him for that. God doesn't put him down for that, but God shows him patience. And look at God's response in this passage. Although he doesn't have to, he gives Gideon a sign. The angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. I don't know about you, but I've never seen fire spontaneously combust from a rock. God was patient with Gideon, and he gave him a sign. Now, when we face doubts about the play caller, I think one of the things that God wants us to do is to learn to trust him a little bit. To understand a little bit of what he's telling us, to see a little bit of where he's guiding us, so that we can begin to learn to trust him for something bigger. Because maybe you have the same challenge flags as Gideon did. You may be doubting him. I mean, Gideon basically threw it back in his face that if you're really with us, then why is all this bad stuff happening? And if our fathers were right about all the miracles that you've done in the past, then why don't you do any miracles today? You know, maybe you think that too. That it seems logical that God must be uninvolved because we see things like the problem of evil in the world and we say that's just too hard to overcome. And if this God of Christianity supposedly used to do miracles, then why doesn't he do miracles anymore? That just seems too convenient of a way to cover up for a lack of evidence. And yet, you kind of like the idea of an all-powerful God. You kind of like the idea that there might be someone out there who is all-powerful and all-knowing and is good. But maybe he just wound the world up and then backed off. And he's not involved anymore. Or maybe you, like Gideon, you heard your parents talk about a God who was at work. A God who was real. But you just haven't seen it in your own life. And so maybe you're not whipping that challenge flag, but you're just kind of tossing it out there. Because you spent a lot of time building up your career, threshing your wheat, trying to protect it in that wine press from the dangers and the disasters that are all around us. Well, let me invite you to take another step forward with Gideon. Because it says that the angel of the Lord disappeared out of his sight. As quickly as he had come, he was gone. And now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And yet that wasn't quite the end of Gideon's doubt. Even as he learned to trust the play caller, Gideon would have to learn to overcome his own self-doubt. The things he believed about himself that could be standing in his way. In the next few verses, actually these verses were in the middle of that conversation. I skipped over them, but I want to come back to them for a moment and let you hear what Gideon believes about himself. It says, the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" So Gideon said to him, "Oh, my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." Now think about what he's saying here. God is speaking to a man who is standing in a wine press, threshing a small amount of wheat, because he's so terrified of the circumstances around him. And God has already called him a mighty man of valor. Doesn't look like it. And now says that he's going to defeat the Midianites, that he will be the one to lead Israel. Well, Gideon definitely has a challenge flag there. Gideon says, not only am I part of the weakest clan, okay, we don't go to battle, we thresh wheat in wine presses. Not only am I part of the weakest clan, but I am the lamest dude in my family. I am the weakest guy in the weakest family, in the weakest clan in our nation. He's saying, God, I am throwing a challenge flag on this one because you have got the wrong guy. Right? Gideon might be saying that basically, God, I'm the last guy you would pick. I have not lived a life that says, I am a leader, I am a man of valor, I am the kind of guy that God would use. I am the last guy that God would pick. And maybe you feel like that this morning. Gideon's even saying, God, I'm skeptical. I'm not even sure if I believe what you're saying. I'm not even sure if you are who you say you are. Trust me, you don't want to use me, God. It kind of reminds me of what they call in the NFL, Mr. Irrelevant. If you watch the NFL draft, and I'm sorry, I'm way too diehard about football, and I watch the NFL draft every year. But again, when your team doesn't go to the playoffs, my team has not been to the playoffs since I was bagging groceries as a 16-year-old. You got to find other things to get excited about. And so I watch the draft because it's new hope for every year. But there's one guy all the way at the end of the draft, the last player picked, and they've kind of made this a celebration by giving him a special jersey and naming him Mr. Irrelevant. Mr. Irrelevant is one of those not-so-good players from one of those not-so-good schools, and nobody really expects him to make the roster or make a difference. But we got to finish this thing out, so somebody just make that last pick and let's get on with it. They call him Mr. Irrelevant. Well, Gideon is basically Mr. Irrelevant. He's the weakest guy from the weakest clan. And you know, David Tyree, who you saw making those catches in the Super Bowl video, I mean, he was practically Mr. Irrelevant. He was a sixth-round pick from pretty far down in the draft. There's only 7 rounds, and he went in the 6th. And he really did not have much of a career with the Giants. In fact, that season, he only had a few catches the entire season. And if I remember right, I don't think he had any touchdowns. But then in the Super Bowl game, on Super Bowl Sunday, he has 2 catches. One of them for a touchdown, and the other one is that famous helmet catch, where he pins the ball against his helmet with like 2 minutes to go in the game to lead the Giants down the field for the winning touchdown. And I remember that play. I mean, you just saw it again, but it's crazy. I don't even know how Eli Manning got out of that sack, why somebody didn't blow a whistle or something, but he does, and he chucks it to who? Plaxico Burress, the best receiver on the team. No. He whips the ball to David Tyree. I'm a pretty diehard football fan. I've been watching that whole game. I guess I missed his touchdown because I still didn't know who David Tyree was. But he's the guy that catches that ball, that makes that all-time play. He will be remembered for the rest of football history, at least, for making the helmet catch.
But David Tyree was the guy you'd least expect. And what's interesting is that David Tyree's story actually begins way before that day. And the rest of his story is actually a lot more important than the play that he made on that day. When he came into the NFL, he spent a lot of energy trying to be as good as he could, trying to make the team, trying to make plays and to get time on the field. And he found that it just was not fulfilling him, and he began to chase a lot of the blitzes and blindsides that attack professional athletes, that attack people not just in sports, but in any kind of business or place of success in the world. When we realize that our success isn't satisfying us, and he started to get into dangerous and destructive situations. And there was a day in his life where his girlfriend, who later became his wife, stopped him and said, "You know what? You are killing yourself with the choices that you are making. And you have to choose either that lifestyle or me." And as he tells his own story, he says that what he actually found was a Bible, the Playbook, laying on her bed, and he picked it up and began to read it. And for the first time, he learned to trust the play caller. He learned to trust God as the play caller for his life, and it changed everything. He got out of his bad habits. He got out of his hang-ups and his hurts and the things that were dragging him down. And he began to live a life that was shaped not by a constant drive for success, but by a thankfulness for the significance that God had given his life. All of this was several years before the Super Bowl. And he will tell you today that as exciting as that Super Bowl was, and as exciting as it is to be the guy who made the helmet catch, he would give all of that up for his relationship with God through Jesus Christ. I didn't even know that about him until I started doing research this past couple of weeks. But I think that's such an amazing story, because sometimes we look at somebody who appears just a little bit further ahead than us, and we say, well, I'm not as strong as them. I'm weaker than them. I'm from the weak clan, and God, you definitely don't want to use me. Or we look at ourselves and we say, God, I don't even know you. I'm not even sure about you. You definitely don't want to use me. But you know what? I think God loves to do this. God loves an underdog too. He loves to take the person that you would least expect, and he loves to take the person who least expects themselves and to teach them to trust him just a little bit as the play caller, so they can overcome some of their own self-doubt and see what he would like to do with their lives. You know, I want to read you a quote from somebody who is kind of in this same position as Gideon, who said that he was not the one that God could use. A guy who had this type of God does not use this kind of guy resume. But let me read you what he said. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, why do you not believe in God? My reply would have run something like this. Look at the universe we live in. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. History is largely a record of crime, war, disease, and terror, with just sufficient happiness interposed to give them, while it lasts, an agonized apprehension of losing it. If you ask me to believe that this is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. Now that is like a Jim Schwartz kind of challenge flag. But this man, the person who wrote that, went on to write a book called The Problem with Pain, where he was able to answer by the use of God's playbook even his own seemingly undefeatable argument. And he became one of Christianity's most influential voices. His name was C.S. Lewis. And you may be sitting in Gideon's seat this morning. You may be sitting in C.S. Lewis' seat this morning and say, my challenges, my doubts are too big to overcome. But let me tell you that if your doubts overcome you, it will delay your game, just like it did for Gideon. And it will keep you from the victory that God would have for you if you learn to trust him as the play caller. And what we see in Gideon's story is that as he overcame his doubt of the play caller, as he learned to trust God a little bit, as he overcame his self-doubt, then God was able to use him to lead others beyond their doubt. As he learned to trust the play caller, overcome his own self-doubt, he could lead others beyond their doubt. And in Judges 6, now in verse 25, the Lord had a specific instruction for him. He wanted to see Gideon's obedience, that he would follow his plays. It says, it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build instead an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement. And take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as the Lord had said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. So we see Gideon's obedience, but we see that it's still mixed with a little bit of doubt. And you may be wondering, why would God ask Gideon to do property damage to this altar of Baal? Well, the short version is that Baal was a false god that the people of Israel were worshiping, and one of the primary ways to worship Baal was child sacrifice. That this was something that was very destructive, very hurtful to their own people, and God is saying, if you are going to trust me as the play caller, if we are going to move forward, then this is one of the key things that is blitzing you, blindsiding you, and tearing you down, and so we've got to tear it down. Gideon, you have to remove that from your life. You have to remove that from your people. Because it wasn't only blitzing and blindsiding his family, but his community. I want you to think for just a minute about what you might need to remove. What might be getting in the way of you trusting God as the play caller? What might be getting in the way of your ability to overcome self-doubt and follow him and begin to lead others through doubt? You know, we've been talking in this series about good things that we let become ultimate things, and how that can become an idol for us. Something that we are motivated by instead of God's plan for our lives. Or maybe it's a destructive pattern that you have in your life that is harmful to your marriage or to your integrity. Or maybe it's something like Gideon that has been passed down to you. This was his father's idol. Something that you've learned from those around you. You know, one of the things for me that threatens to be a good thing that becomes an ultimate thing is work. You know, I am in constant danger of becoming a workaholic, and I've been there at places in my life where I put so much value in what I'm doing that it leaves me open to destructive tendencies, things that I don't want to be involved in because I'm too focused on the achievement. That the more I do, well, the more there is to do, and it's never really done. And if I'm motivated by what I do, then I'm constantly driving harder and harder and never really accomplishing anything. I'm living by achievement and by my own image of myself instead of God's image of me. So what does it mean for a workaholic to trust God as the play caller? How would I lead others out of that thing that blitzes and blindsides me that I need to remove? You know, because work can still be a good thing. It can be a good thing to charge hard and to love the thrill of competition and to keep driving forward. But if I put my significance in that, then I'm devastated when things don't go my way. And maybe you felt this. But if my significance is found in who God is calling me to be, then if things don't turn out quite how I'd hoped, it's not quite so devastating. When things turn out how I'd hoped, I'm much more eager, much more ready to share the credit with other people and to pass things off from me because I realize it's not me, it's God that is at work around me. My significance is no longer based in just myself, but in how God sees me. So that while work is still an important part of my life, it's not the only thing in my life. And that's a subtle change, but people will notice that in you. I can tell you my wife definitely has noticed this in me and the change that it has made in me, not only in work, but in time with family and other things like that, as we've worked hard on this over the last year. pulling back from some of those achievement-driven things and saying, God, what are our priorities? What is your playbook? What would you have me do? And how do I make sure that everything I do comes back to that? You know, for you it may be something different, but I'll encourage you to think about what needs to be removed. You saw that Gideon had some fear in doing this, and he had fear rightfully so, because the next morning what happened is that the men of the village showed up, saw that their altar was gone, and decided that they wanted to kill whoever did it. I would be afraid too. But Gideon's own father, the man who owned the altar that he just tore down, came out and said, you know what, guys? If that was really a God, then let him defend himself. But don't you come out here and kill my son. You see, because Gideon was willing to remove what delayed his game from his own life, he had already begun to have an impact on the people around him, starting with his own family, his own father. Gideon was reassured many times by the Lord, as we've seen, with words like, the Lord is with you. Have I not sent you? Surely I will be with you. Because Gideon was learning to trust the play caller, learning to trust God for his life. And like him, you can begin to have that kind of impact on yourself, on your family, on your community, on your company. Learning to trust the play caller on something little, to overcome a little bit of doubt so that you're ready to trust him for something big. Because Gideon needed an altar tear down before he was ready for the army tear down. And if you look at the last verses we're going to look at today, it says, at this time, then all the Midianites and Amalekites, the people of the east, gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. All right, it's that time of year again. They're coming to trash the produce of the land. But look at this. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Then he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. No longer is this the man who was so scared to tear down the altar that he did it by night with just a few people. This is a man who is calling not only his weak clan, but all of the clans around him to follow him, to lead them through doubt, to trust God as the play caller, to overcome the enemy that had blitzed and blindsided them for so many years. And it tells us that over 32,000 people showed up to back up Gideon. What I want you to notice here is that it's not just Gideon powering up. It's not just Gideon saying, I'm going to do it, I'm going to be great. It's not us powering up, it's God empowering us. Because this messenger, when God spoke to Gideon, this was God appearing to a person. God come down to earth to talk to him. Just like Jesus Christ was God in the flesh, come down to say to us, you may be the person that you least expect, but I love an underdog, and I can do something with you that you could never imagine. That is the message of God's grace to your heart this morning. Whatever your challenge flags may be, whatever doubts may be holding you back, He's not angry at you for that, but He wants to give you an opportunity to learn to trust Him just a little bit so that you might see something big that He wants to do with your life. If I can go off of the football metaphors for just a minute, I've got a quote from Shakespeare, something that he wrote once that I think captures this very nicely. He says, our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good we oft might win by failing to attempt. Isn't that often too true and sadly true? That there is something that lies before us, that we could truly accomplish something great, not because we are so amazing, but because God is so amazing and He wants to work through us. But we often miss out on it because our doubts delay our game and we're afraid to try. Or maybe you're not much of a Shakespeare fan, but I can offer you another English writer. P.G. Woodhouse says in one of his Jeeves and Wooster books And I should make note for you that before Stephen Fry was ever Dr. House, he was Wooster first. That's how I came to know him. But this is what he says in one of those books. It was one of those cases where you approve the broad general principle of an idea, but can't help being in a bit of a twitter at the prospect of putting it into practical effect. I explained this to Jeeves, and he said much the same thing had bothered Hamlet. I love what it says there. You approve the broad general principle of an idea, but you're in a bit of a twitter at putting it into effect. So maybe you're sitting there this morning. You approve of the broad general principle of the idea of God as a trustworthy play caller. You approve of the broad general principle of trusting Him a little bit so that He might do something great. But when you walk out of these doors this morning, you're going to have to put it into practical effect, and that can be a little bit harder. But let me just invite you this week. Pick up one of your challenge flags. Don't let this doubt delay the game for you or those you might lead. Don't let this be another moment where we all look at the TV and say, oh my goodness, I guess I might as well go to the bathroom or get some more nachos because it's going to be a while. They threw the challenge flag. Pick up one of those flags this week. Trust God to be the play caller on something little so that He can prepare you for something big. Would you pray with me? God, sometimes it's easier to sit in a room and think about how we'd like to trust You as the play caller than to actually do it. But Lord, I pray this morning that every heart here, if it has been touched by Your Spirit, if we might be empowered by You as Gideon was, that You would help us to overcome our doubt, even if we don't have every last tiny bit of the answer, even if we have to trust You for something unseen, that we might begin to trust You a little bit, that You would prepare us for something big. God, I believe that You can do this. I know that I've seen it in my own life. I thank You for that. And Lord, I pray over the men and the women in this room, the leaders in this room, the families in this room, that You might show it to them as well. Lord, as we listen to this last song, I pray that You would just touch our hearts. If there are places that we need to find faith in You, we'd remember that we can find You faithful. Amen. You know, it's possible that you might be that underdog today. You might be that Gideon, and that God was using this time to stand before you and say that you are a mighty man, a mighty woman of valor. If you've been thinking about that this morning, I would love to talk to you afterwards, as well as right down the hallway and third door on the left is our hearth room, where people right here from Horizon would love to meet you, get to hear a little bit of your story, and even help you talk about what some of your challenge flags might be. So I want to thank you for being here this morning. I want to thank you for sharing this time with us. And I pray that God might show you His faithfulness to you and invite you back next week as we continue Playbook. Thanks for coming.